And our speaker this morning is Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer, who was here a year ago, and I think many of you were here. I'll just give you a short bio, and then Jack will take over. He's an educator, writer, and activist who taught justice and peace studies for 25 years at the University of St. Thomas. He graduated from St. Olaf College in 1973 with a major in political science and Union Theological Seminary in New York City in 1977 with a Master of Divinity degree. So welcome, please welcome Jack.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? All right. Well, thanks for inviting me back. That says something right there, that you let me speak again, so thank you. So I'm going to try to talk about two really important things to me, and I'm going to try to make the case that they're actually related. So bear with me. But the first part is, I'm guessing that most of us in this room are really concerned about our democracy under attack and the threat about autocracy and authoritarianism. So I'm going to start talking about that, and then I'm going to weave that into a conversation about theology and kind of our responsibility to pick up on a part of the tradition that really calls us to be peacemakers. Okay. So first, I think this needs to be said, and it isn't said enough in public discourse. We have a lot of problems with our democracy in terms of the way our country is structured. The Constitution itself is a problem. It limits democracy in really, really serious ways. We've got small states with less than 1 million people having the same representation of California with many, many, many millions. So, and that was actually, I think, a compromise to the slave states that were worried about being outmaneuvered by powerful, bigger states. Anyway, so that's an enormous obstacle to actually having the will of the people as a whole implemented. And then we've got the Electoral College, which is a reinforcement of that same principle, where very few Republican presidents have actually won the popular vote. And they win because of the Electoral College system. So that's, again, a structural obstacle to what I would regard to be authentic democracy. And now, more aggravated, we have the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court now is really under the control of a very small number of people who are almost completely unrepresentative of the U.S. population, the things that we care about, the issues that are in a majority focus. They're stifled by the Supreme Court, including now an overwhelming dominance of conservative Catholics on the court, who are using their conservative or are implementing their conservative views, and in many cases overriding even historical precedents. So that's just something to keep in mind, is that the struggle for authentic democracy is really a deep one. And in a way, we're kind of hampered by some of these things, and we try to overcome them by having a large number of people who are voting in elections that actually can surpass or get over this problem. The second thing I want to talk about, and I'm sure this is a huge concern for, again, many of us, is the MAGA movement itself. So in addition now to those obstacles that are kind of institutional, we now have an unprecedented movement around, I think, a cult figure, Donald Trump, that is very, very dangerous to democracy. In June, I received a telephone call from a documentary filmmaker. I wrote about this in an op-ed piece that some of you may have seen in the Star Trib. And he called me out of the blue, and he was a documentary filmmaker that won an Academy Award for a documentary he did about Charlie Clements, who was a fighter pilot, U.S. fighter pilot in Vietnam, who refused to carry out bombing missions when he realized what the U.S. was doing there. Eventually was discharged, trained as a doctor, and then went to El Salvador as a doctor and worked with the war-torn people in that country for years in this documentary. So anyway, I had never heard of this guy. I had read the book about Charlie Clements. I had not seen the documentary. But anyway, so he was authentic, and I was wondering, well, what the hell is he calling me for? It wasn't to do a documentary about me, that's for sure. But what it was is he had uncovered some writing that I had done in a book that was published in 1992, in which I described U.S. support for undemocratic, authoritarian, oftentimes military dictatorship-run states. And so when we talk about democracy in the context of the United States, the U.S. has a much more complicated history than the simple line that we are fighters for freedom and democracy, and that's what we have done throughout history. Because in fact, after World War II, a couple of things happened. One, the United States replaced Great Britain as now the only dominant empire. So we replaced the British Empire. Now, in replacing the British Empire, policymakers in the United States decided it was very important to rebuild Japan and Western Europe, and it was also very important to maintain or expand our interests in the so-called third world or developing world. And the principal means that was used to exercise influence in the third world was military dictatorships. So pretty much every country in Latin America was run by a U.S.-sponsored and oftentimes imposed dictatorship. This was true in many parts of Africa as well. So we have a history, and I had written about El Salvador in particular, how the U.S. had supported national security states in a place like El Salvador, which meant, in that case, again, an authoritarian ruler or military dictator was the principal power. Democracy was a dirty word. Democracy was subversion. When I led trips for years in Latin America, or in Central America, and went to El Salvador, we would travel with U.S. citizens who wanted to know more about what was going on. And the first night that we were there and all gathered together, we would talk to them about words they could not use in public. They could not mention the name Romero. They could not mention the word democracy, because using that word in a public place, it wasn't so much that it would put us in danger, although that's possible. It would be that, in all likelihood, we were being followed and tracked on who we were meeting with, and it could put those people in danger. So anyway, I had written in this book in 1992, using El Salvador as an example of the U.S. backing authoritarian states. So when we think about the MAGA movement today, it is a movement towards autocracy. And they're doing pretty much everything to try to limit voting, to try to disrupt counting of votes. It's pretty clear if you have seen the most recent interview with the Republican vice presidential candidate, they do not accept losses. And in fact, they engaged in fomenting a violent mob. So we have lots of specific problems in this moment related to that movement. But one of the things that I want to emphasize is that the problem that we have related to militarization and war, and what enhances the need for peacemaking, is that the problems we have are much deeper than MAGA. If we're really committed to working towards democracy and peacemaking and alternatives to war, this is very much a bipartisan problem. Now, I don't mean in any way to minimize, in fact, I would try to magnify to the largest extent the concern we should have in this room about the precarious moment our country is in right now. But at the same time, I want us to think beyond that, and I want us to think about how deeply embedded it is in the U.S. psyche and in U.S. policy that we are a military empire, and that we need to be, and that others want us to be, and that it is, in fact, in service to noble purposes. So that does not mean that everything the United States does foreign policy-wise is horrible, but it has a really bad track record, including some really bad things I think that are going on right now. Back to the MAGA movement, I want to just, if any of you get the Star Tribune, okay, if you saw the paper today, two really interesting articles among, I haven't read the whole paper. One is quoting former General Mark, I don't know if it's Milley or Miley, is it? Milley, okay, thank you. Former chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who says that Trump, quote, is fascist to the core and the most dangerous person in the country. So that again is just emphasizing this moment. Another thing that makes this moment particularly important for us to wrestle with is the rise of Christian nationalism. And there was this other article on a different page. Let's see if I can access it here. Just a second. Yeah, so I took a picture of it. I just wanted to read one quote. It's so small, it's going to be a challenge. It says, Christian nationalism is neither Christian nor patriotic. It is a powerful, focused ideology made up of 1 in 10 Americans, and actually, in sympathetic, 3 out of 10 Americans are polled are very sympathetic to the ideas of this Christian nationalism. And what it is, it was created to spread the misfounded belief that the U.S. was founded as a Christian nation and that Christians need to take their country back in order to do God's will. Christian nationalism seeks to fuse two identities, that of a Christian with that of being an American. So this rise of Christian nationalism is also kind of unique to our moment. And it made me think, I believe Mark 1, verse 1 reads very simply, the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Now, very simple, right? Who cares? Nice little intro. But that first sentence is done in the context of the Roman Empire claiming that the good news, the gospel, was the birth of the emperor's son who was divine. So we've come a long, long way from the idea that somehow Christianity should be used by people in a belief system to live out certain values within wherever we live, to the idea of Christian nationalism, which is somehow that the nation must be returned by Christians to being a nation that was chosen by God to do God's will in the nation and the world. It's kind of a frightening project. So, it seems to me, now I want to kind of move in the direction of seeing connections between this anti-democratic impulse that we see right now and that we've seen in our past, and then thinking about our challenge to be Christian peacemakers. Now, again, the overall thing one takeaway I would hope that you would have is that the problems that we have today in the United States are deeper than MAGA. They're deeper than Donald Trump. And our challenge as Christians, no matter what happens in the upcoming election, is going to be challenging for us, and that we should be ready to engage as peacemakers, probably in a fairly unfriendly environment. It could be very, very unfriendly, or it could be pretty unfriendly. In either case, the challenges are going to be there. So now I'm going to ask you to jump in the weeds with me as I try to give you Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer's critique of theology and the Bible. And this could be done, some of you know I've written about violence in the Bible and the Quran, Old Testament, New Testament. So I'm going to bring you into the weeds, looking at the role that theology plays in distorting and how we might choose a stream of the tradition that could really inform our peacemaking. So don't nod off. I'll try to be very brief. And I've done this in very quick form. So I expect questions and about this. So I want to do this because I think my New Testament professor, Walter Wink, was right when he answered the question, what's the world's most important religion? And he said, in his belief, it was violence. Because almost everybody believes that violence saves. It doesn't matter if you're Christian, Jewish, Muslim, or Hindu, others. In many ways, violence seems to be the guiding idea of what works in the midst of whatever injustice might be out there. So, what I want to highlight is that too often in Christian theology, we have linked God and hope to God's violence. We have linked hope to God's violence. And theologically, I want to make the case that there are three main storylines in the Bible, all involving violence. The first one is the Exodus story, interpreted as a story of liberating violence. God hears the oppressed people cry out. God delivers their enemies into their hands. The promised land is given over to the people. So that's one narrative. The second narrative emerges that after an actual history, the Jewish people, the chosen people, the ones that were the beneficiaries, supposedly at least, of this exodus, have now been pummeled by foreign empires and have been sent into exile. And so the storyline in this is during this period that monotheism becomes a reality in the tradition. Before that, Yahweh was a tribal deity. Now, in the aftermath of things going very badly, the people didn't give up the religion, but they reinterpreted it so that God was responsible for everything. If we were punished, it was because we did something wrong. God was punishing us. And that storyline came with a promise of reversal. If the people did something differently, then God's favor would be on their side and they would be able to defeat their enemies, and then things would get back on track. So that's the second worldview. The third one emerges after hundreds and hundreds of years in which there never was this reversal in history. In fact, things got worse. And so that worldview emerged as this apocalyptic, end of the world kind of theology that said, don't put your faith in history and a historical change. Place your faith in the end time, which is coming soon. And when it comes, our enemies are going to get what they deserved at God's hand. And those of us who have been faithful, good things are going to happen. So those are the three dominant worldviews in the Hebrew Scriptures, and they carry right over into the New Testament. So if you were an average Jewish person living under Roman domination, you would be asking yourself two questions. One question would be, what did we do to deserve God's punishing violence? So what did we do wrong? And the second question would be, what do we need to do to earn God's favor so that God will be on our side again? Thank you. So those were the two questions that were likely to be asked. Now, I'm going to come back to that, but I want to also suggest one other thing. There's three other stories in the Bible that I find intriguing, and they're the three different perspectives on empire. So maybe you disagree with me that the U.S. replaced the British Empire. It's interesting how many right-wing people during the Iraq War, lots of think tanks, all claimed, we're an empire now. This is great. So anyway, I think there are three different approaches to empire. And these are really, really important in terms of how we live out a vocation of peacemaking if we choose to do that. So the first one, ironically, is a pro-empire stream. And even in some of the prophets, Isaiah promises that all the wealth of the world is going to come to Israel. if you read the Joseph story, Joseph is actually a servant to the Pharaoh, right? And under Joseph's tutelage, all the wealth of the world around them, all the land came to them, came to the Pharaoh, and all the common people were enslaved. So there is a pro-empire narrative rooted in this idea that God's liberating violence is in fact available and good, and faithful people will benefit from it. Now, lest you think that that's just a crazy idea, I would ask you to think about what happened to Native Americans. Years ago in South Africa, there was a Kairos statement written. I don't know how many of you ever heard of it or read it, but it was written by Christians in South Africa in the midst of apartheid. And Kairos was understood as not just regular time, but urgent time, a time for decision making. Anyway, a number of people in the U.S., Jim Wallace, myself, and a few other people got together, and we wrote a Kairos statement for the U.S. And one of the people that was part of our group was a theologian named Robert Warrior, Native American, who made it very, very clear to us that the Exodus was not a story of liberation, and that the native people in the United States were the Canaanites. So my first point here about empire is that there was and is a kind of pro-imperial stream that I think is now pretty deeply embedded into the U.S. psyche about the U.S. role in the world. Okay, the second approach to empire that we find in the Bible is really anti-imperial. And this is one of the favorites of nonviolent Christians. You say, great, well, the problem is they root their nonviolence in this apocalyptic worldview. And so the idea was that you resist empire, and that's why it's so attractive to many nonviolent activists. This is a call to resistance to empire. The problem is the solution is God's vindicating violence at the end time. But that's where a lot of people, if they're even interested in a second narrative about empire, they're interested in this particular theme because it is very, very anti-imperial. But it also is rooted in violent expectations of God's vengeance. So what are we to do? Well, we have a third option, and it's a minority stream within the New Testament. So let's be honest about that. There is not one Jesus. There are multiple Jesuses. So we have to make decisions about what do we follow? What do we listen to? What's foundational to our belief system? How do we want to live in the world? But this third stream related to empire is resistance to empire with a commitment to nonviolence, to a nonviolent God. Wow, that's a big difference. And I'd like to suggest, I'll wait on that. Okay, so those are pro-empire, anti-empire rooted in God's violence, anti-empire rooted in the nonviolence of Jesus. Those are our choices. And you can pretty well guess where I come out on that. So in Jesus' time, as I mentioned, they'd be asking these two questions. There were also two places where they rooted hope. Again, they're under Roman domination, a really powerful foreign empire. And there are two places they rooted hope were, one, that God would send a military Messiah, that a Messiah would rise up and with God's power would be able to defeat the superior empire. Now, that's a really attractive story. I would say it's also a really dangerous one. And I would point to the angst that many, many, many liberation theologians in Latin America felt about introducing the people to a Jesus that loved the poor, cared about the poor, hated their oppression, and would be with them and help them overcome the powers that be. Now, if you were to ask me, is that the right thing? Absolutely the right thing to do. But priests and nuns and others that I know from that period just live with this deep, deep pain, realizing the repression that was unleashed on these communities for really claiming this message of a liberating Jesus. So that's this one place to root hope in Jesus' time was God's power would reside with a Messiah that would arise up and they'd throw out the Romans. Well, that didn't work very well. And right around the time Jesus was born, there was a military rebellion. It got crushed. The second largest city was burnt to the ground by the Romans. So that left you wondering, well, what else? Where's another place to root hope? And the answer is that apocalyptic worldview. The idea that God would come soon and end this nightmare, and our enemies would be defeated, and we would triumph. So those were kind of the two overwhelming themes of where you root hope. Now, this is a futile exercise, but I'm just going to name the approach that Jesus' contemporaries took. The Sadducees, you've heard of them. They basically chose collaboration with Rome. That was the safest route. The Pharisees had been kind of they did some very powerful symbolic resistance, and they got just crushed by the Romans. So by the time of Jesus, the Pharisees have moved in the direction of personal piety, that was the solution. If we would all just be more faithful and more pure, then God's favor would be in our way, or would come our way. Then you had the Sicarii. Their response was terrorism. The Sicarii would assassinate Jewish leaders who were collaborating with the Romans. So that was another possibility. John the Baptist was an apocalyptic prophet announcing the imminent end of the world. The Essenes, they also were apocalyptic, and in their community, they specifically taught the hatred of enemies and were preparing for the final battle that they would wage and throw out the Romans. And then we don't know exactly when the Zealots were around, but probably some evidence of the Zealots, which was basically kind of a revolutionary group that thought they'd fight and defeat the Romans. So it's in that context then that we meet multiple Jesuses in the New Testament, but we have this stream. And this stream was about broadening the community. Samaritans were hated because they intermarried with others. He talks about the Good Samaritan. Apocalyptic expectations are flying all over the place. Jesus talks about the kingdom as a mustard seed, a subversive weed. Hatred of enemies. What does Jesus say? Love of enemies, right? Turn the other cheek, walk the extra mile, all those things. Those who use the sword will perish by the sword. Expanding circles of gratitude, compassion, inclusivity in terms of who is in the community. From my vantage point, there's a lot in the New Testament that suggests people were still operating under a worldview in which bad health was a sign of sin. And salvation in the Hebrew Scriptures is almost in every case that you hear that term about the defeat of enemies. Jesus seems to say that salvation is opening up and welcoming people in, or returning people into community. It's a return to health, the health of the community itself. So we have all kinds of options here. So I just want to talk about a few implications, and then I want to open it up to any questions you have. The first implication for me, and this is a really hard one right now, I'm really struggling. I have a brother who is he's gone from being really, really healthy to probably fairly close to the end for him, with a lot of dementia, so I'm dealing with that. And then I'm dealing with MAGA and just beaten down by the news, all those things. So when I say what I'm just about to say, I don't do it lightly. And what I say is that no matter what happens to us or to our country, what's going on in the world, we have important work to do as peacemakers. So if things get worse after this election, we have important work to do. If things are starting to get better, we still have work to do. And that's one of my major points is and this is something I struggle with politically. Well, I don't really struggle because I think, I'm just going to be really frank. I think we're up against a dictator on one hand, and we have someone else who really does believe in the empire, similar to almost every other U.S. leader, that a militarized empire is the key to global security. So, whatever the outcome in this election, we have important work to do. A second implication is one of our tasks is to try to model a different kind of Christianity than Christian nationalism. And let me give you some real-life examples of how these distorted biblical themes that I've touched on play out in reality. So one of the strongest groups, lobbying groups in the country, are Christian Zionists. And so in addition to AIPAC, which is a Jewish lobby group, Christian Zionists have their own lobby group, and they send lots and lots of money to Israel, and they lobby on behalf of Israel. And they do so because theologically they believe that Jesus won't come again until Israel is in control of all of what they see as the biblical gift of land to the Jews. And so in order to precipitate Jesus' coming back, they're pouring all kinds of political and financial interest in supporting Israel. And you might want to know, well, what's going to happen to the Jews when Jesus comes back? And they get one more chance to convert, and if they don't, then they fry. So this is a bargain that I'm not sure I'd be willing to take. Anyway, so that's a real life example. A third implication would be when I ran for the House seat, and Martin Sable dropped out, and then it came down to whether Keith Ellison or Gail Dorfman, a county commissioner, or I would win the Democratic Party endorsement. At that endorsing convention, a question was asked about Israel. Now, that may sound, big deal, except for questions were never allowed about Israel. When I ran for Senate 2 years later, not one question in any debate, any format, official format, not one question was ever allowed about Israel. Well, it came up miraculously in the House. And so my recollection is that Gail and Keith punted. And I don't blame them. Kind of the official way to approach things was to just kind of universally express your support for Israel. Well, this was right after Hamas had won the election in Gaza. And so I said that if we thought starving the Gazans or the Palestinians would lead to peace or was helpful to either the Palestinians or Israel, that was just completely stupid. That the only way out was to have an equal commitment to the well-being of each of those groups and to have policies that reflected that. The shit hit the fan. I mean, it was, the whole room erupted. And about half the people wanted to kill me, and half the people were just so grateful that someone had dared to say this. So, what does this have to do with our conversation? One of the things that is desperately needed in this country is for the United States to stop thinking of Israel as a militarized base in the Middle East and to stop identifying U.S. interests with Israel's interests all the time, especially when they have a right-wing leader who is just pulling the puppet strings perfectly. I think engaging the U.S. in horrific complicity. So that's another thing. Another conflict that we face that I think as peacemakers we have to face is the war in Ukraine. Now, there's a real strong view that I can sympathize with or understand that believes in the right of self-determination. I think most of us probably would agree with that. My problem is there are nations around the world, including some big ones, Indonesia, India, Brazil, and others, that have been working behind the scenes trying to put forth alternative ways to end the war, peace plans that would end the war, that would deal with somehow with the interests of the two major parties in the conflict. My problem isn't just that the U.S., my problem is that the U.S., by all accounts, has been trying to undermine all of those initiatives. And I have a suspicion, and this may not be correct, but it's based on my experience in Central America and elsewhere, where I think the U.S. and then the USSR used people throughout the world as geopolitical cannon fodder. And I worry when the rhetoric in the United States changed from Ukraine's right for self-determination to degrading the Russian military, that's a really big shift. And it's a big shift I think that we're locked into now, where the Ukrainians, eventually, this war is not going to end this war has to end. And when it ends, there's going to have to be concessions. There's going to have to be negotiations. The longer it plays out simply as a military conflict between these two powers supported by superpower and others against Russia, who really is losing? The Ukrainians are, I think, and their future is probably losing. So again, it's really hard to be a Christian peacemaker in a context of some of these issues. Israel, Palestine, Ukraine, military spending, the rise of China. All of those things we have to, in my view, we have to ask ourselves, or try as best we can, drawing on this minority tradition within the New Testament that calls us to be voices for peace. And this is not an easy environment to do that in, but I want to invite all of us to do that as well. All right. I think I'm going to stop right there and just say, again, it's a hard challenge that we face, but let's really try to build on that minority tradition, because it's in that tradition that I think we root our hope. And I'll stop there. Thank you. Yeah, I'll take.
We can do a question and answer,
absolutely.
Right?
Can you say something about about Sudan? Because you mentioned nothing about them, and that's a whole other place that I think purposely is not being talked about.
Yeah, we owe some gratitude to Nicholas Kristof, who has been really reminding the world that these crises are not limited to Gaza and to Ukraine. And so that is another one where I think an international community response attempting to bring this to some kind of a resolution is really important. Now, I confess I'm not an expert on Sudan, but you're absolutely right that this is probably some of the worst humanitarian and some of the worst human rights abuses are taking place in that context. And we, as a nation, have been pretty silent. Yeah.
Purposefully, I think.
Yeah. Say more.
Well, the issue for me is that we have no vested interest in them other than their resources, their natural resources. So our only gain is they don't care what happens, like you talked about, the fodder.
Yeah.
They're just, I think our country is just saying, let the fodder happen. As long as we get the resources and we figure out how we can take it, we don't care.
I think that's...
What is the rest of the world?
Yeah.
That's where I think it is. I think this is avoidance of dealing with, as a conscientious person, a way to deal with peace there.
Yeah.
I don't know what that is, but...
Yeah. No, I would share, you said it very well. I think that in many cases, if you want to know where we're engaged or where we choose not to be, you need to look at resource issues. So that makes sense. Yeah. Oh, yeah.
I think about violence at our borders and all that happens to people who are trying to immigrate here and are here, and the violence that happens to them in ICE, and how to peacefully support them. And I have a question for you. Is the School of the Assassins, or America, is that still open, that school that we taught how many terrorists to...
Okay. First, your first part of your point. One of the great dangers in the U.S. is when we allow our leaders to cultivate historical amnesia. And what I mean by that is I have been struck now for a long, long time how the refugee flows are never understood in the context of the long history that I talked about in terms of the backing of repressive governments. If you wanted to go further, in my analysis over the years, the U.S. also learned after a certain point, military dictatorships were destabilizing, and there were other ways to kind of maintain influence and control. And using debt as leverage was one of those, and there are other trade agreements were others. So, addressing the crisis of survivability and viability within the economies of many of those countries, and recognizing our responsibility to be able to respond to historical problems that are largely created by the choices that were made should be, again, another high priority for us. As to the School of the Americas, it changed its name a long time ago. I think that school is not involved in the same way as it was, because, again, in my analysis, the U.S. seeks influence. And in a lot of ways, we're kind of losing our influence because we don't have much to offer. But I think that the days of sending in or supporting directly, in Latin America at least, death squads, I think there's very few areas where that would be happening in the same way. And the School of the Americas would not be, its purpose would be very different now, even though that doesn't mean we shouldn't be mindful of ways in which U.S. foreign policy either aggravates or helps in resolving these conflicts. Then let's go over this side, okay?
Okay. Throughout history, we've had leaders rise that speak to peace and justice, the solution that you're offering. Just coming to mind, Jesus was one of those individuals. And then more recently, we had Gandhi. Then we had Nelson Mandela, Martin Luther King. And they raised the conscious level of us that there's injustice in the world, there's violence in the world, and we need to fight against that. And every one of those folks, maybe Nelson Mandela wasn't assassinated, but every other one was, in the case of Jesus, crucified, and the others were assassinated. It's sort of an ebb and flow. And when you ask us to continue the effort, I'm not going to say fight because that's a violent word, the effort to promote peace and justice in the world, it's almost in the circumstances that you described that we have to put ourselves forward and be willing to be sacrificed for that cause?
Well, a couple of thoughts. One thought is that in liberation theology, someone introduced me one time as Jack Nelson-Pallmeyer is a liberation theologian who roots his liberation theology not in the violent story of the Exodus, but in the nonviolent example of Jesus. I thought, boy, that was great. I'll take that any time. And when I taught liberation theology to students, one of the themes that I really liked, there are a couple of them. I'll just name two here in response. Christology was one, with this big fancy word, is what's the meaning of Christ. And John Sobrino from El Salvador, a liberation theologian, said, we need to understand that Jesus was killed as a consequence of his life and faith. It wasn't an atoning sacrifice. It was a consequence of the way he lived. So that's one very important thing, is that we do live with consequences with how we live, and sometimes that's risky, sometimes it's not. It could be risky in different ways. And then the second one was, I really liked the concept of resurrection, at least as I interpreted it. So one concept of resurrection is it was God's way of saying yes to Jesus' life and faith. But the other was, throughout El Salvador in particular, which is where I spent more time, in the base communities, they said the main lesson that they learned was that leaders get picked off. And what resurrection was the community persisting, the community gathering around the work that needed to continue. Because in that way, that's how you keep Jesus alive. That's how you keep your leader alive. So the overall message of leadership is that it's really, really important to build communities with lots of participation that are not just identified with the leader. And then the last thing I would say about it is, most of us don't need to be concerned about that. Not yet, anyway. What we need to be concerned about is just defining for ourselves, what does it mean to live an authentic life in these times and do the best we can? And I would say, and doing that in the context of a relationship with others. And it's not just about better resisting or better activism. It's about living with joy. It's about living with meaning. There's a lot of good benefits of being connected with others around not just even the things that most matter to us politically, but the things that matter to us in our families and the things that matter to us. And from my vantage point, the people I love being around the most are people who are active in the world, who are joyful, funny, playful, kind, compassionate, because that's what feeds me.
So yesterday I was driving around running errands, and I was listening to a report on NPR, but I think it came from National Public Radio, regarding the NAR, the National Apostolic something, and it's talking about what you were talking about. The mega group was the Christian progressive, not progressive, but the fundamentalists, and these 7 pillars that they were targeting: education, banks, politics, the media, and a couple other ones. And these people are not going to stop. They're going, trying to get on the school boards, and
right.
That's where this whole banning books coming from, and they are thinking there are activities that's going to help bring about this end times.
Yeah,
So I don't know if anybody else heard it, but it was, I was riveted by listening to this.
And terrified.
Exactly.
I didn't hear it, but I was talking to my wife who heard part of it. And that's what I say about as much as I care about the bigger issue of U.S. empire and its historical ties and present even among Democrats, etc., that doesn't take away the sense of urgency I feel about the present moment we're in. And one of the reasons that it is such an urgent moment is because some of the groups that are kind of at the heart, many of the groups at the heart of the MAGA movement are groups that are really, really organizing at multiple levels. Again, both to try to discredit the upcoming election, make it more difficult for people to vote, but with a much bigger agenda than that. And I think the scary thing about the present makeup of the Supreme Court is that they have begun to unravel the separation of church and state. And
That's the end goal.
yeah, exactly. And so, again, that's another, it's not just a big issue. What you're saying is we really need to break it down into what's going on multiple levels within our communities where we need counter voices. And I think they're there. I think they exist, and I think they need to be strengthened, and we need to find ways that we plug in at whatever levels we're comfortable in doing that. There's multiple places. But thank you for bringing that up. And I was not familiar with that particular configuration of this effort. So, yes.
Hi. Yesterday I attended a workshop on restorative justice, and I've been real active. The people here in the church know I've been very active in gun violence prevention, and kind of am going more and more towards restorative justice because you mentioned circles, and I think we're at a time where we have to decide, are we going to give in to all of the hopelessness and the helplessness, or are we going to choose something that can help us? My husband and I were in Jordan for a year working, and they used restorative justice there to solve conflicts. And I don't know that they even called it that, but that's what they did. They got into groups, communities, families, circles. And the people, I was at Seward Longfellow.
I was just going to ask.
Yeah, that's where I was. And they had a training session yesterday, and it was fabulous. And I know they're going to do more. I need something, and I know a lot of you do. We just need something to hold on to that we can grab onto right now. So
I assume Michelle Braley was there? Yeah. She's a member of the small faith community that my wife and I are a part of, the community of St. Martin. And they do really, really good work. And there's more and more need for that and opportunities for that, because it's pretty clear that the punishment system, especially for young people, doesn't work very well and doesn't make our communities safer. But your bigger point is really, really an important one. I think the strategy of MAGA and Trump is exactly just to wear us down. I think of the physical and spiritual consequences of the last 8 years. Just enormous, and it scares me in terms of if we have to deal with that again with them in charge. So I think you're right that finding each of us still getting up in the morning and not being beaten down by the news and figuring out places where it feels good for us to be engaged. And we won't all be doing the exact same thing, but we all need to find those places that are embodying the world that we want to see, are joining with others in a constructive and hopeful way around things that matter. So thank you. That is absolutely vital.
Jack, I have a question.
Okay.
What to do about I don't see the leaders in our churches really addressing the whole nonviolent Jesus, the message of the nonviolent Jesus, and how that is in contrast. I heard Reverend Munther Isaac, he's a pastor in Bethlehem. He was speaking here in the Twin Cities, and his whole thing was we have to do more than just pray for peace.
Yeah.
So how can we get them to speak more publicly about defending the nonviolent Jesus and his message?
Yeah. I don't know. No. No, it's really important, and so I think it starts with you, each of you, us, using our voices in arenas where we can to try to make that happen. I think theologically, unfortunately, this is my critique, and I'll say something beyond that, but unfortunately, the Christian tradition, as it has taken shape, essentially interpreted the meaning of Jesus' life and death in one of two ways. Either Jesus was the atoning Messiah, sacrificial death, or Jesus was the apocalyptic one to come and fix things at the end time. And I think those two frames have dominated the life of of most churches. And so the nonviolence of Jesus is either completely ignored or just a marginal piece. Now, the good news is I think that there are many people within the church and who have left the church because they desire a greater emphasis on taking care of the environment, of addressing climate change, of working to end the wars, of really questioning, do we really want to spend $1.7 trillion to upgrade our nuclear arsenal? No, I don't. So I think there's so, I don't know how to say this exactly, but there are so many opportunities that are lurking within the aggravated crises that we face, in which the voices for peace, if magnified, I think have a chance, especially if it's linked to things like, do you really want to spend $1.7 trillion to upgrade the nuclear arsenal? Is that what you want to do in light of what just happened in Florida and all these countries? You know, I used to ask students I would give them like eight or so pots or 10 pots and ask them what percentage of the discretionary budget they wanted the money to go to. They all chose priorities that reflected, I'm guessing, most of the people in this room. The balance is so out of whack in light of the time that we live. So, I mean, that's not a great answer to your question other than to say, I think that what's happening in the world makes the voice for peacemaking and better priorities and different priorities within the church more meaningful. I think the distortion that's taking place within Christianity has driven so many people away. And I think the silence on these issues has driven some other people away. So I don't have any desire to try to convince a Christian nationalist white supremacist that they're wrong. I think that's a waste of my energy. But I think it isn't a waste of our energy to be talking constantly about issues that matter in the context of the institutions that we're part of.
Okay, I wanted to ask you, Jack, thanks. This is taking me back to the old Newman Center when you used to visit us over there. What about non-governmental and non-sectarian approaches? Specifically, I'm thinking about the Nonviolent Peace Force that started here in the Twin Cities and is now international. And it was based on the principles of Martin Luther King Jr. And Gandhi.
Yeah.
And it was all about creating a nonviolent army, so to speak, who were trained in the principles of nonviolence. And they've had some success. but not in Ukraine, not in Gaza,
Right.
but there was a story in their latest newsletter about basically some Arabic nomadic peoples who have goats and sheep, and these farming Sudanese people who plant things. Now, there's an
Right.
inherent conflict between,
Yeah.
what the animals could do, So they had this story about how the nonviolent peacekeepers trained by NPV, or NP, the Nonviolent Peace Force, got these two groups to talk to each other. And so it brings in restorative justice, brings in the principles of nonviolence. But it's a really small story.
Right.
But reading that late at night, thinking about Ukraine and Gaza and the Trumpers and all this, I'm like, okay, the world doesn't seem to be going the way my mom and people like you have been advocating for.
Right.
But then I look at this little group that uses international funding, and any comments about them or organizations like them that go around, but they could use government funding to go away from the forces of empire. They're dreaming about nuclear upgrades and stuff,
Right.
and going down these other principled ways.
Oh, thank you for bringing that up. So the way I would respond is that I like to think about my life and our life together as, okay, in this circle, Minneapolis, St. Paul, this area, what's going on? Okay, we've got some restorative justice stuff. We have some efforts now, even within policing, where a good friend of mine, the husband of Michelle, is a social worker who is embedded with a police officer and goes to many settings that are trying to de-escalate conflict rather than escalate. Okay, nice circle. And then on a broader circle, I think about activism and action within a broader community. And then you might even take in the whole state. So this is going to be a little bit of off, but I'll come back to it. A couple years ago, the last election cycle, my wife and I decided that we were going to join efforts to flip the Minnesota Senate, because nothing could happen as long as that Senate was controlled by Republicans. It wouldn't get a hearing. My wife worked for an organization called Exodus Lending that was helping people break out of the payday lending trap. But the goal was to get rid of them, right? How do you do that? Well, it couldn't get a hearing. So we decided to concentrate our efforts on like 5 or 6 key races that could flip. It flipped, and a lot of really good things happened. Okay, then we go to a regional circle. And organizations like Fresh Energy and others, they deal a lot with Minnesota, but they're also engaged in more regional conversations about climate change and policies, and then the national level, and then the international level. So I think those non-governmental, smaller efforts are still really important to support, both because they're doing good work, helping or trying, and sometimes succeeding, and really succeeding in their effort to resolve differences peacefully, but also because those become or can become kind of models for something that could be lifted up and institutionalized in ways that would allow it to have a greater impact. So, I think those efforts are really important. I think they're really worth putting money into, and if you got time to volunteer and those kind of things. And what's hard as an individual is just to try to sort out what one person or one family can do. So you have to find the places that actually feed you and give you energy and hope, and not feel bad about that if you're not doing everything, which is, again, the advantage of being part of a community. I know I've benefited a lot. Theologically, I don't know where I am in terms of the church anymore, but I really value this community of people that I've been part of for 35 years, and we gather weekly. And it's people with different skills that are involved in all kinds of issues I care about that I can't be involved in every one of them. So that's what I would say, is that whatever the circle is, they're really important. And then, my vision when I ran for public office, which, my vision of what I was trying to do was I wanted to use my voice as an insider, if I won, to help build what I would call is a movement of movements. Because one of the things that's really important is, even though we can only act in certain spheres, I wanted us to be in relationship so that we weren't in silos just working on an issue. We were doing important work, but we were seeing it as connected to a bigger whole and a bigger transformation that was needed. So as I make decisions about how to be involved in different ways, that's kind of the calculation I'm making. Is yes, this is an important issue to me, but I want it to be part of a broader, larger conversation and effort for a deeper transformation. Okay. You've been very patient, so maybe we should say one or two more questions, and then I'll stick around for a little while.
There's a couple things that my mind is going. In regard to the atonement theology, that really is so closely connected with the empire, and it's connected to the beginning of Christianity being connected to the empire with Constantine.
Yeah.
And in one place where that did not survive until it was taken over in the 7th century was with Celtic spirituality. They do not believe in the atonement thesis of Jesus, why Jesus died. The other thing, I just wanted to recommend a small little book. It's called Spare the Child, and it's by Philip Grevin, who wrote a very big book called The Protestant Mind. I think he was at Rutgers, I'm not positive. But it's a very small book about how punishment is the way that we raise children in the United States. And the whole purpose of punishing children and causing them to have their will broken by age 2 is in connection to being prepared for the coming of Jesus. And it's the whole reason we have the kind of punitive and prison system we have in the United States. It's a wonderful little book.
Okay.
Philip Grevin.
Spirit of the Child.
Spare the child.
Oh, Spare the Child. Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you for that.
Any more questions?
All right. Well, thank you. And again, I'll stick around for a few minutes if anybody wants to add anything.